She thought she was marrying a man with nothing but calloused hands and a patch of cold mountain earth. But the day he turned the wagon east, her entire understanding of him shattered. Everyone in the valley whispered when Eliza Harper announced she would wed Daniel Crow. Some laughed outright. Others shook their heads with pity. Daniel was known as a mountain man, quiet, rough-edged, living high in the timberline where winter bit hard and neighbors were miles away. He trapped, hunted, and brought pelts down to town once or twice a year. He owned no visible land, no cattle, no proper house by anyone's measure. And Eliza, though poor herself, was still considered too good for such a match. But Eliza had seen something different in him. She had met Daniel during the worst rainstorm the valley had seen in a decade, the same storm that had nearly destroyed her small herd and her last hope of survival. The sky had cracked open without warning that day, rain slashing sideways like thrown knives. Eliza had stood helpless in the mud, cattle bawling in panic, her crude shelter collapsing under the weight of water and wind. Her hands were bleeding from rope burn, her boots sinking deeper with every step. She remembered thinking, "This is how it ends." That was when Daniel appeared, silent as the mountains themselves. He said nothing at first. He simply took a rope from her hands, looped it with practiced ease, and began moving cattle as if the storm didn't exist. When she finally looked at him, soaked and shaking, he met her eyes and said calmly, "They won't last the night out here. Come with me." She had hesitated only a second. Daniel led her and the herd to a narrow ravine hidden behind rock and pine, where a natural overhang kept the rain off and the ground stayed firm. He worked until nightfall, steady and tireless. When it was done, Eliza realized she had been crying, not from fear, but from relief. He left before dawn without asking for thanks. Weeks later, she found herself seeking him out in the mountains, bringing bread she had baked and words she hadn't planned. Their courtship was quiet, almost shy. Daniel spoke little of himself, and Eliza didn't push. She only knew that she felt safe with him in a way she never had before. So when he asked her to marry him, she said yes, even knowing what people would say. They married in the fall of 1885, under a pale sky and watchful mountains. Eliza moved into his mountain cabin shortly after. It was small, sturdy, and clean, though plainly furnished. Life was hard but honest. Daniel worked constantly, disappearing for days at a time and returning with supplies or coin. Eliza learned to live with silence, with cold, with effort. She never complained. But small things began to trouble her curiosity. Daniel never worried about money. Not once. When she needed cloth, he had silver. When tools broke, he replaced them without hesitation. And sometimes, late at night, he would sit outside, staring east, as if listening for something long forgotten. One morning, as winter loosened its grip, Daniel packed the wagon. "Where are we going?" Eliza asked. "Somewhere I should have taken you sooner," he replied. They traveled for 2 days, descending from the mountains into rolling land Eliza had never seen. The roads grew smoother. Fences appeared. Orchards. Stone walls. By the third morning, Daniel turned the wagon off the main road and onto a long, tree-lined drive. Eliza's breath caught. At the end of the drive stood a mansion. Not a house, a mansion. Stone and timber, wide verandas, tall windows catching the morning light. It sat surrounded by green pasture, grazing cattle, and outbuildings larger than most farms in the valley. Eliza stared, unable to speak. Daniel stopped the wagon and finally turned to her. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried something heavy. "This is mine." Her world tilted. You said you were poor." "I said I lived simply," he answered. That part was true. Daniel helped her down and walked her toward the house. Along the way, he told her the story he had never shared. He had been born into wealth, rail money, land grants, businesses that stretched farther than he cared to name. But his family had been ruthless, obsessed with expansion at any cost. Daniel had walked away after a violent dispute with his father, leaving everything behind except what he could carry. He took to the mountains, determined to live by his own hands and not by other men's suffering. "This place," he said quietly, "was left to me by my mother. I kept it hidden, leased the land through agents. Never set foot here. Why bring me now?" Eliza whispered. "Because when I saw you standing in that storm, refusing to abandon your cattle, I knew you weren't someone who would love me for what I owned. And I realized I didn't want to hide anymore." Inside, the house was warm and lived in, not grand for show but built for family. Eliza ran her fingers over polished wood, over portraits long covered and forgotten. She felt no greed, only awe and a strange sadness for the lonely boy Daniel must have been. Life changed, but not in the way the valley would have expected. They did not move into town society. Eliza insisted on keeping her independence, her work, her values. The mansion became a place of refuge, not excess. Daniel opened the land to struggling ranchers during hard winters. Eliza organized food and shelter for widows and orphaned children. The same people who had mocked her marriage now spoke the Crow name with respect. Years later, during another fierce storm, Eliza stood on the veranda watching rain roll across the fields. Their cattle stood safe in sturdy barns. Their home glowed behind her, full of warmth and life. Daniel came to stand beside her. "Do you ever wish you'd chosen differently?" he asked. She smiled, slipping her hand into his. "I married a man who saved my cattle in the rain," she said softly. "Everything else is just shelter." And in the wild, unforgiving West of 1885, that truth mattered more than gold. The first real test of Daniel Crow's hidden world came the winter after Eliza learned the truth, when the mountains sent down a cold so deep it cracked trees like rifle shots and drove desperate men out of the hills. Snow buried the passes, isolating ranches and turning small mistakes into death sentences. Word spread fast that the Crow land had shelter, food, and a man who didn't turn people away. They arrived at dusk at first, one family then another, wagons creaking, children wrapped in threadbare quilts, faces hollow with hunger and pride bruised by the need to ask. Eliza met every one of them herself. She remembered too clearly what it felt like to stand helpless under a brutal sky, and she never let anyone beg. She simply said, "You're safe here," and meant it. Daniel watched her that winter with a quiet awe. He had known wealth, but he had never known purpose like this. The mansion that once felt like a ghost of his past became something living again. Fires roaring in rooms long cold, laughter echoing through halls meant for silence. The barns filled with cattle not his own, and the fields bore tracks of borrowed horses and shared labor. Not everyone welcomed the change. Men from Daniel's former life took notice. Business partners, distant relatives, men who smelled opportunity in the way vultures smell weakness. They rode in one sharp morning, coats fine, boots clean, eyes calculating. They spoke of deeds and contracts, of how Daniel's generosity threatened order and profit. "You can't feed half the valley forever," one of them said, glancing dismissively at Eliza. "And you shouldn't let her run your affairs." Eliza did not flinch. She had learned that courage did not always shout. Sometimes it stood still and refused to move. Daniel answered calmly, "This land is mine. What I do with it is my concern." That night, he told Eliza the truth he had avoided even after the mansion revelation. His family would not stop. They never had. Kindness to them was waste. "You don't have to stay," he said quietly. "I won't blame you if this is more than you wanted." Eliza took his face in her hands, weathered palms warm against his cheeks. "I didn't marry a house or land or a name," she said. "I married a man who stepped into a storm and didn't ask what it would cost him." Spring came late and violent. Meltwater flooded the lowlands, washing out roads and trapping travelers. One night, a rider arrived bleeding and half-frozen, carrying news that changed everything. A group of ranchers, men Daniel's family had been squeezing for years, were planning to rise up. Guns would be drawn. Blood would be spilled. And Daniel's name was already being whispered, whether he liked it or not. Eliza understood the weight on him before he spoke. She had seen enough of the West to know how quickly justice turned into vengeance. "You don't have to fight," she said. "No," Daniel agreed. "But I won't hide either." What followed was not a battle, but something rarer. Daniel rode out to meet the men himself, unarmed, with Eliza at his side. They stood before angry faces and shaking hands, before fear sharpened into something deadly. Daniel spoke plainly about the land, about the lies his family had built their fortune on, about how things could be different. Some men laughed, some cursed, but some listened. And when Eliza stepped forward, her voice steady despite the wind, something shifted. She spoke of survival, not profit, of shared winters and buried children, of how the land did not belong to any one man, but demanded respect from all who lived on it. By sundown, the guns stayed holstered. It didn't change the West overnight. Nothing ever did. But it changed enough. Daniel's family withdrew, not out of mercy, but because the cost of pushing further had become too high. The Crow land became known not as a stronghold of wealth, but as a place where fairness still breathed. People said strange things about Eliza after that she had tamed a mountain man, that she had softened a giant. They were wrong. She had stood beside him, while he chose to become something more than what the world expected. Years passed. Children were born under that wide sky, strong, loud, unafraid. The mansion aged into a home marked by fingerprints and scuffed floors and stories told by firelight. Daniel never returned to the mountains to live, but he rode there often, standing among the pines that had once hidden him, remembering who he had been and who he chose to become. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Eliza found him at the edge of the field at dawn, watching the mist rise. "You ever miss it?" she asked. "The quiet?" He smiled, slow and genuine. "I found a different kind of quiet." She leaned against him, the land stretching endless and open before them. Once, she had feared storms because she faced them alone. Now, even when thunder rolled across the plains, she knew shelter was more than walls or wealth. It was the choice to stand, again and again, when walking away would be easier. And in the unforgiving West, that choice built something stronger than any hidden mansion. It built a legacy,